The arrangement had been filed under the category of diplomatic solutions, which was the Council's preferred language for decisions that solved more than one problem at once. Princess Mia had been a problem, not an acknowledged one, never that, but the kind that accumulates in the margins of official documents over many years, written in the careful vocabulary of royal physicians who have learned to say concerning things in the least alarming way possible. Phrases like requires monitored rest and constitutional sensitivity, and not recommended for extended exertion, had appeared in her files with such regularity that they had become, in the minds of the Council, simply her definition. She was the princess who required monitoring. She was the princess about whom one was cautious. She was, in the estimation of the men who administered the Aelith court, a situation that had needed resolving for quite some time. James had arrived on a Tuesday, which he would later describe as the most administrative day of the week, and therefore appropriate for the occasion. His file, reviewed by the Council the morning before his arrival, had produced no particular reaction, which was precisely why it had been selected. He was a human diplomat of median career trajectory, no recorded incidents, no documented eccentricities, and a service history that read, in its thorough unremarkableness, like something generated to fill a required field. The Council had reviewed it with satisfaction. He would not complicate things. He had walked into the reception hall, shaken the hands that were extended to him, and then done something that caused a brief and unrecorded disruption in the proceedings. He had looked past the assembled officials and found Mia standing near the far window, and he had crossed the room to introduce himself to her first, before the formal order of introductions had been observed, which was not how it was done. The Council had exchanged glances. The chief physician had made a small note. Mia had looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating an expectation mid-arrival. He had said, "I read the briefing documents on the flight over. All 47 pages. A pause. I have some questions, but I was told there would be a reception first, so I'm prepared to wait." She had said, "What kind of questions?" He had said, "The kind where I'm not sure the documents were actually about you." The reception had continued around them while they stood near the window, and the Council had watched with the mild attention of people who had already written the outcome and were simply waiting for events to confirm it. They had not been watching closely enough to notice that the conversation by the window had not followed any of their projections, or that the princess, who was documented as tiring easily in social situations, had not moved from that spot for the next hour and 20 minutes. They had returned their attention to the seating arrangements, which were complicated, and to the question of the trade agreements, which were more complicated still, and to all the significant machinery of governance that required their focus. Outside the tall windows of the reception hall, the twin moons of the Aelith system were rising in the pale evening sky, enormous and unhurried, casting the kind of light that made the old spires of the palace look as though they had been cut from something luminous. A transport vessel traced a silent arc above the city, its running lights blinking in the sequence that indicated inbound cargo from the outer sectors. The world was conducting its business at the scale it preferred, enormous and indifferent, and inside the hall a council of administrators was satisfied that it had resolved a situation, and near the window a woman with long, elegantly pointed ears was listening to a human ask her questions from a list he had apparently been composing since somewhere over the third transit corridor, and was finding, to her own mild surprise, that none of the questions were about her health. The kitchen had not been designed with experimentation in mind. It was a palace kitchen, which meant it had been designed with ceremony in mind, and the distinction mattered more than James had anticipated when he had announced, on the fourth morning of their residence in the East Wing, that he intended to cook dinner. The staff had received this information with the particular stillness of people who have been trained to show no reaction to anything, and were currently being tested at the outer limits of that training. Mia had watched from the doorway as he surveyed the available equipment with the expression of a man who had expected a kitchen, and was instead confronting an archaeological site dedicated to the preparation of formal banquets. He had made, in the end, something he described as a modified protein stew, modified being the operative word, as the original recipe had required 3 ingredients that were not available in the Alith system, and had been replaced with local equivalents he had selected based on color and proximity on the shelf. Mia had tasted it with the careful neutrality of someone who had been raised to be diplomatic about food. There had been a silence. She had said, "What was this supposed to taste like?" He had said something else. She had looked at the bowl for a moment, and then said that she thought the Velhari root he had used in place of the 3rd ingredient was probably the issue, as it inverted the flavor profile of anything acidic it came into contact with, which was why it was traditionally used in cleaning compounds. James had written this down. He had then asked her how she knew that, and she had told him that she had read the palace's domestic chemistry index when she was 11, because she had not been permitted outside that week and had exhausted the available alternatives. He had looked at her over his notes and said that the domestic chemistry index sounded like exactly the kind of reading material that produced a specific sort of person, and she had said, with the precision of someone who had been waiting years to deliver this particular observation, that it had also produced an excellent working knowledge of which compounds could be introduced into a ventilation system if one's physician scheduled another mandatory rest period without consultation. James had stopped writing and regarded her with what she was beginning to recognize as his genuine attention, which was different from his polite attention in ways that were subtle but consistent. He had said, "Have you ever actually done that?" She had said, "The statute of limitations on palace infractions is 15 years. He had made a note of a different kind. The dinners that followed were collaborative in the way that negotiations are collaborative, each party bringing something to the table and neither entirely certain of the outcome. Mia knew the ingredients. James knew, in a general and enthusiastic way, what he wanted the result to be. The gap between these 2 bodies of knowledge produced, over the following weeks, a series of meals that ranged from genuinely successful to instructive, and a running conversation that moved through subjects the palace menus had never touched. She told him about the Alith trade routes and the political pressure building in the outer sectors. He told her about the 3 diplomatic postings that had preceded this one, each in a system, with its own elaborate set of unwritten rules that he had learned by breaking them in ascending order of consequence. She found this funnier than she had expected to find anything in recent memory. He seemed to find her finding it funny more interesting than the stories themselves. The household reports sent to the council during this period noted that the princess's dietary intake had improved and that she appeared to be maintaining a stable routine. The chief physician reviewed these reports with professional satisfaction and filed them in the category of outcomes. Satisfactory. He did not visit the East Wing himself, which meant he was not present on the evening that Mia, reaching past James to correct his handling of the temperature controls on the cooking unit, held her arm next to his for a moment and said, with the tone of someone noting a minor administrative discrepancy, that the Royal Medical Database had her listed as unable to tolerate sustained physical activity, and that she had, that afternoon, run 12 laps of the East Courtyard without particular difficulty, and was finding the documentation increasingly difficult to take seriously. James had looked at the temperature controls and then at her, and then said that he had several follow-up questions and that they could wait until after dinner, because whatever she had just done to the heat setting smelled considerably more promising than anything he had managed on his own. The intruder had made several mistakes, the first of which was choosing the East Wing, and the second of which was choosing a Tuesday, which James had already established as the most administrative day of the week, and on which he was therefore in the habit of reviewing documents at the desk in the outer study rather than anywhere else, which placed him with a direct sightline to the corridor, which was not information the intruder had apparently factored into his planning. The third mistake, and the one that would most occupy the subsequent incident report, was not accounting for Mia. She had been in the adjoining room when the corridor sensors registered the unauthorized entry, and the alert had come through on the household system, with the soft chime that the palace's original architects had selected to avoid causing alarm, a design decision that James had always found optimistic. He had looked up from his documents, he had looked at the corridor, he had then looked at the doorway to the adjoining room and begun to say something, but the doorway was already empty. What followed lasted approximately 40 seconds. James watched most of it from his position behind the doorframe, where he had relocated with the instinct of someone who has learned, across 3 diplomatic postings, to identify the boundaries of situations that do not require his direct participation. The ceremonial blade that had been mounted on the corridor wall, decorative, the palace inventory listed it, of historical significance only, was no longer on the wall by the time the palace guard arrived, having been summoned by the same household alert, and having traveled from the security station at a pace that had seemed, until this moment, professionally adequate. The guard stood in the corridor doorway. They looked at the intruder, who was on the floor in a configuration that suggested he had not chosen to be there. They looked at the blade, which was no longer decorative in any straightforward sense. They looked at Mia, who was standing with the particular stillness of someone who has finished a thing and is waiting for the room to catch up. One of the guards, the senior one, opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again, and said something that the incident report would later summarize as an expression of professional acknowledgement, which was a generous characterization of what had actually been said. James emerged from behind the doorframe. He looked at the corridor with the expression of a man updating several working assumptions simultaneously. Then he looked at Mia and said, in the tone he used when he was composing questions and was not yet certain of their order, "So." She handed the blade to the nearest guard, who accepted it with the automatic reflex of someone who had not yet determined what else to do, and said, "I'll explain over dinner." She did explain over dinner, with the methodical precision of someone who has been waiting for the correct moment to introduce a complicated subject, and has decided that the correct moment is now, over the modified protein stew, which had improved considerably since the early experiments. The explanation involved aleph biology, the gaps in the human medical literature, and a specific protein compound found in Velhari root that was not, as it turned out, primarily useful in cleaning compounds. James had put down his spoon at some point during the second paragraph and had not picked it up again. The core of it was this: the royal physicians had not been wrong exactly. Mia's constitution in early life had been precisely as documented, limited, carefully monitored, the subject of 47 pages of cautious language. What the documentation had failed to account for was the mechanism. Aleph physiology, she explained, was built on a principle that human medicine had not encountered because human medicine had never had reason to look for it. The biological architecture was dormant by default. It required conditions, specific conditions involving sustained emotional security, consistent nourishment of a particular kind, and the absence of the low-grade ambient stress produced by environments in which one is treated, perpetually and with great kindness, as something that might break. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long has this been happening?" She considered the question with the honesty she had been applying to things since the window conversation at the reception, which felt like a different era. She said, "Gradually, since approximately the second week." He said, "The second week." She said, "You asked me what I thought about the outer sector situation on the 9th day. No one had asked me that before. I think that was probably the turning point." James picked up his spoon. He looked at it. He set it down again and said that he had several more follow-up questions and that they were going to need a larger notebook. Mia said that she had already ordered one. He looked at her. She looked back with the expression of someone who had been running 12 laps of the east courtyard without difficulty, and had simply been waiting for the paperwork to catch up with the reality, which, she noted, was a situation she had some prior experience with. The notebook arrived the following morning, which was a Wednesday, and was therefore, by James's established taxonomy of days, a day more suited to practical action than administrative reflection. He had written this distinction at the top of the first page, and Mia had read it over his shoulder and said that she found his relationship with the weekly calendar genuinely unusual for a diplomat. And he had said that structure was how a person remained functional in the presence of the unexpected, and she had said that she thought that was probably the most diplomatic thing he had said since his arrival. And he had said that he had his moments. The first section of the notebook was devoted to questions, which James organized with the same thorough unremarkableness that had made his personnel file so reassuring to the council. He numbered them. He grouped them by category. He had written, at the top of the first category, the heading physical architecture, and beneath it 14 questions of increasing specificity, the last of which Mia read with an expression that moved through several registers before arriving at something that was adjacent to being impressed. She said, "You wrote this last night." He said, "I didn't sleep much." She said, "Question 11 is extremely specific." He said, "I had time to think." She answered the questions in order, which he had expected, and with a precision that suggested she had been composing the answers for considerably longer than one night, which he had not. The picture that emerged from the first category alone was enough to require a second cup of the Aleph tea that had replaced his preferred coffee after the third week. When Mia had pointed out with diplomatic honesty that his preferred coffee smelled like something the household maintenance staff used on the exterior hull plating of the palace's docked shuttles. The biology was not complicated once explained correctly, she said, but it had never been explained correctly because the people doing the explaining had been working from a framework that did not account for it. Human medical models assumed a fixed capacity. Aleph physiology did not work on fixed capacity. It worked on something closer to a calibration system, and calibration required the right conditions, and the right conditions had not, historically, been the conditions of the East Wing under prior arrangements. James had written all of this down and then looked at the page and said, "So the physicians weren't wrong about what they observed." She said, "They were wrong about what it meant." He said, "That's a very generous interpretation." She said, "I've had years to arrive at it." The equipment question was resolved with a practicality that the council, had it been watching, would have found difficult to categorize. James located, through the palace's procurement system, a set of training apparatus that had been ordered for the guard rotation program and had been sitting in a storage wing for 11 months because the guard rotation program had been postponed pending a budget review that was itself pending a committee formation, that was itself pending a scheduling alignment that no one had prioritized. Mia reviewed the equipment manifest with the focused attention she brought to chemistry indexes and outer sector political analysis, and said that it would do. James filed the requisition under Household Wellness Initiative, which was a category he created for the purpose, and which the palace administrative system accepted without comment, because palace administrative systems are not designed to ask follow-up questions. The training began on a Thursday, which James noted was the most structurally neutral day of the week, and therefore appropriate for new undertakings. The East Courtyard in the early morning had a quality of light specific to the Aleph system's primary star at low angles, a particular clarity that had something to do with the atmospheric composition, and that James had tried to describe in a message to a colleague in the outer sectors, and had eventually summarized as extremely honest light, meaning it showed everything as it was. In that light, Mia moved through the first morning's exercises with a deliberateness that was not the deliberateness of someone learning, but of someone remembering, as though the capability had always been present and was now simply being reintroduced to the person it belonged to. The guards assigned to the courtyard rotation that week filed reports describing their observation duties as uneventful, because they were guards and not poets, and because the administrative form did not have a field for what they had actually seen, which was something they discussed among themselves for considerably longer than the report suggested. The senior guard, who had been present in the corridor on Tuesday, said very little during these discussions. He had the expression of a man who had already revised his understanding once this week, and was not certain he had the capacity for a second revision so quickly. James, reviewing the training from the courtyard steps with his notebook, made a note in the second category, which he had headed simply observed, underlined once, and beneath which he had written, so far, 4 words and then stopped. Because 4 words were sufficient, and he had learned, across 3 diplomatic postings and 1 marriage that was becoming increasingly unlike its documentation, that the most important things rarely required more than that. The crisis arrived on a Friday, which James noted was the worst possible day for a crisis, being neither the structured beginning of the week nor the administrative middle, but the point at which everyone had already made plans and was disinclined to revise them. The outer sector situation, which had been building with the patient momentum of things that are described in briefing documents for months before anyone treats them as urgent, had finally produced an incident specific enough to require a response, and the response required a council session, and the council session required everyone to be in the same room, which was the Grand Assembly Hall, which had acoustics designed to make every statement sound more significant than it was, a feature that the council had always found useful, and that James, sitting in the observer's gallery with his notebook, found clarifying in a different way. The situation was this. A coalition of outer sector factions had moved to blockade the Aelith system's primary transit corridor, which was the route through which approximately 60% of the system's inbound cargo traveled, including the specific protein compound that Mia had been eating since the second week, and that James had therefore developed a personal as well as a diplomatic interest in protecting. The blockade was not yet a military action, technically. The Council used the word technical with the frequency of people who understand that technical distinctions have a limited lifespan. The debate that followed lasted 3 hours and produced, in James's notebook, 12 pages of observations and 1 very direct marginal note that he had written at the end of the second hour, and then bracketed, which was his system for indicating that something was true but not yet the right moment to say it. The Council's available options were reviewed in the order of their insufficiency. The diplomatic envoy option required a credible show of force to be credible, and the credible show of force option required personnel that the current rotation could not supply with any confidence, and the confidence gap was the thing that sat in the center of the room and was referred to by everyone using words that were not the words for it. At the beginning of the third hour, someone suggested James. This was not framed as a suggestion so much as a process of elimination arriving at a conclusion, but the effect was the same. James, from the observer's gallery, wrote the word Thursday in his notebook and underlined it, which was his system for indicating that an undertaking was beginning whether or not the timing was ideal. Someone else, with the reflex of a person whose professional habits had been formed over years of working from documentation, began to say something about the princess. The sentence got as far as her documented and then stopped, because the doors of the Grand Assembly Hall opened, and the room's attention moved in the way that room's attention moves when something enters that was not in the agenda. Mia walked in. She had dressed for a council session, which in Aelith formal terms meant a degree of precision that the room registered before it registered anything else. Her long ears, which the court had spent years treating as incidental to the more pressing subject of her constitution, were carried with the particular quality of someone who has stopped managing other people's reactions to her and has decided to simply be present. She crossed the floor to the central table, placed both hands on it, and looked at the council with the expression she had deployed on the senior guard in the corridor, which was the expression of someone who has finished a thing and is waiting for the room to catch up. She said, "I've read the briefing documents." The counsel looked at her. The chief physician, who was present in an advisory capacity, looked at his own documentation with the expression of a man whose paperwork had just become dramatically inconvenient. She said, "All of them, including the ones from the outer sector monitoring stations that were filed under pending review because no one had prioritized the committee." She paused. "I had time. The East Courtyard training finishes early." The council member who had begun the sentence about her documented constitution had not yet closed his mouth. James, from the observer's gallery, turned to a fresh page in his notebook. He wrote the date at the top. He wrote Friday and then crossed it out and wrote, next to it, in smaller letters, actually a reasonable day for certain things, which was the closest his taxonomic system had ever come to a revision. What followed was not a debate. It was something more like an orientation. Mia moving through the strategic dimensions of the outer sector situation, with the precision she brought to chemistry indexes and training schedules, and the correction of James's temperature settings, laying out not only what the briefing documents contained, but what they implied and what they had failed to ask, which was the gap she had apparently been examining since before anyone in the room had identified a gap. The council listened with the progressive attention of people discovering that the conclusion they had written was not the document they were now reading. The chief physician turned a page in his own notes and found nothing on it that was currently useful. He turned another page. He wrote something small in the margin. Whatever it was, he underlined it twice, which was more than James used, and suggested a different relationship with the moment of revision entirely. The mission had been classified under diplomatic resolution, which was the council's preferred language for situations in which someone had gone to the outer sectors and returned with the blockade removed and the transit corridor reopened, and a set of negotiated agreements that the monitoring stations would spend the next several weeks processing into their formal systems. The classification was accurate as far as it went, and it did not go very far, because diplomatic resolution did not have a subcategory for what had actually happened in the outer sectors. And the council, reviewing the mission report, had decided by unspoken consensus that creating one could wait until after the transit corridor was fully operational and everyone had slept. James had written his portion of the report on the return journey, in the small cabin of the diplomatic vessel, with the notebook open on the fold-down desk, and the stars moving past the viewport in the particular way they moved at corridor transit speed, which was not the way they moved in any natural context, and which he had spent 3 postings trying to find the right word for, and had eventually recorded in the notebook simply as honest. For the same reason, he had used the word about the East Courtyard light, because it showed things as they were without the interference of atmosphere or expectation. Mia had written her portion standing up, because the fold-down desk was occupied, using the cabinet surface on the opposite side of the cabin, with the focused efficiency she brought to everything since the calibration had completed, which was James's word for it, and which she had accepted on the grounds that it was more accurate than the alternatives. Her portion of the report was longer than his. It was also, he noted, considerably more diplomatic in its language, which he found instructive given that he was the one with the diplomatic posting on his file. He said, "You used the phrase measured engagement 3 times in the opening section." She said without looking up, "It was accurate 3 times. He said, "It's also what I would call generous, given what actually happened." She said, "The report is a document that will be read by the council, filed in the administrative system, and referenced in future briefings. I have calibrated the language accordingly." He wrote something in the notebook. She glanced over. He had written calibrated and underlined it, and drawn a small arrow pointing to her section of the report. She looked at this for a moment, and then returned to writing with the expression of someone who has decided not to dignify a marginal note with a response, which was itself a response, and they both understood this, and the transit corridor moved past the viewport in its honest way. The reception on their return was not the reception that had greeted James's original arrival. That reception had been designed to manage a situation. This one was not sure what it was designed to do, and the uncertainty showed in the way the council arranged itself in the landing bay, formally, but with the specific quality of formal that is adopted when no one has been given clear instructions, and everyone is therefore defaulting to the most recent applicable precedent, which in this case was a reception for returning diplomats, which fit the situation only partially and showed at the edges. The chief physician was present. He had brought a document. He presented it to Mia with the expression of a man delivering something that had required significant professional effort and a complete re-examination of foundational assumptions, which was an expression James recognized because he had seen it on his own face in the East Courtyard on the first Thursday. The document was the revised medical assessment, all of it, every cautious phrase and careful limitation, reviewed, corrected, and reissued with a thoroughness that suggested the chief physician had decided that if he was going to be wrong in the official record, he was going to be comprehensively right about being wrong. Mia accepted it. She read the first page with the stillness she had in the corridor on Tuesday, the stillness of someone who has finished a thing. Then she looked at the chief physician and said, "Thank you. This is very thorough," he said with the dignity of a man who has earned a difficult moment. "I have added a note in the methodology section acknowledging the limitations of the prior framework." She said, "I saw. You used the phrase foundational recalibration." He said it seemed accurate. She said it was accurate. James, standing at the edge of this exchange with his notebook, wrote foundational recalibration and considered it. Then he wrote below it, "The council is going to need a larger cabinet for the revised documentation," which was true, and also the kind of observation he had learned to share selectively, and he shared it with Mia on the walk back to the East Wing. And she said that she had already submitted a procurement request, and he stopped walking for a moment and looked at her, and she looked back with the expression of someone who has been patient for years and has developed, over those years, a very precise sense of timing. The original assessment report went up on the wall the following Wednesday, framed, at the corner of the corridor where the ceremonial blade no longer hung, because the blade had been relocated to a display case that also contained the mission documentation and the procurement request for the larger cabinet, and a copy of the chief physician's methodology note, which Mia had decided belonged together as a collection, the way that things belong together when they tell a single story from different angles. James had added one item to the collection without telling her. The page from the notebook with 4 words on it, written on the first Thursday in the honest light of the East Courtyard, which read, in his unremarkable handwriting, "She was always this." The council had returned to its significant matters. The transit corridor was open. The twin moons rose over the palace in the unhurried way they always had, enormous and indifferent to the distance between what had been written and what was true. And in the East Wing, the story that had been filed under diplomatic solutions continued in the way that true things continue, not because they have been resolved, but because they have been, finally, seen.